Welcome to our webinar, Winterize Your Horse with Dr. Joyce Harman. Today's webinar is brought to you by Dox Hemp, hemp with CBD, no THC, that can support your horse's immune system and keep him or her calm and relaxed. Dox Hemp is veterinarian approved, available in powder or oil. Dox Hemp, your leading source of CBD for horses and pets. Now, here's your host, Stephanie Bradley.
So I want to get started so that we leave 15 minutes for question and answers at the end of the webinar. Everyone, please mute your microphones. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box so we can address them at the end of Dr. Harman's talk. As y'all know, tonight I'm talking with holistic veterinarian Dr. Joyce Harman about taking care of our horses during the winter. Welcome, Joyce.
Thank you, Steph. Winter in the Northern Hemisphere is just getting underway. And we had one of our first really cold winter days. But I know that in the way north, they already have full winter. And down in the Southern Hemisphere, and we have at least one person from there, they're going into summertime. So this will be a little bit less relevant, but winter will come back next year.
Well, and I feel like for those of us who are in the winter phase, it gets more and more challenging to figure out how to help our horses get through winter, in large part due to climate change and all the temperature changes we've been experiencing lately. The question for me is, do I put a blanket on or not?
That's a really good question. Actually, the way that, especially those of us who've been in horses all of our lives, we often have a pattern. If we've lived in the same area, we have our expectations of temperature. We kind of might have had a plan. And now with the fluctuations that we have in temperature, even some of the more northern parts of the country will have warm temperatures during the middle of winter. So it isn't such a simple thing, but hopefully by the time we get through tonight's webinar, we will have a better handle on how to handle the variabilities that happen.
So yeah, do I blanket or not?
That is the question. So it is not a straightforward answer. So we're going to spend some time on it. One of the things is that we need to ask ourselves the questions that we've got here. And this webinar will be up on the YouTube channel, so you'll be able to re-look at it and share it, and we'll have it available as a PDF also. So these questions, do you live in a cold climate? And by cold, I mean that it goes below freezing. There are lots of people who live in climates that rarely go below freezing, and yet even the horses in those areas can get chilly, but for the most part, the horses there don't need a lot of blanketing. Do you have shelter from the wind or the rain? Does your horse live inside or out? These are all questions to ask yourself. Make notes about your situation as we go through. Are you going to ride hard enough to produce sweat on a regular basis? Are you going to ride frequently? Is your horse clipped? We'll talk about clipping later on. Do you have time to dry his coat out? Is your horse cold or warm natured? So some horses run cold, some hot. Is your horse very old? In nature, horses wouldn't get to be 30 years old. They would have been long since eaten by some kind of critter. So we have to take into consideration our horse's age, and particularly our ones that are very old. Can your horse help you decide the blanketing question? In some ways, they will tell you just because they'll walk away from you. But there was actually a study, a Norwegian study, that showed that horses can actually be taught to communicate whether they want a blanket or not. Fascinating reading. So it goes back to, we can listen to our horses. They actually can tell us a lot. So check out this article. It's pretty cool, and it's something else you can teach your horse. You may not like the answers always, but that's okay. So the reality about horses is that they are designed for cold weather. They are not designed for hot weather. There are some breeds that really do well in hot weather, the Arabians, the Florida cracker horses, probably some of the Australian, outback kind of horses. But for the most part, horses thrive in the cold, and they are much more stressed in the heat. Fur works. They have fur for a reason. So look at this picture down here for a minute. There's one horse with a blanket, and there's snow on top of the blanket, right? And there's two horses here without a blanket. And guess what? There's just as much snow on their backs as there is on the horse with a blanket. The reason that that snow is on the horse's back is because their fur is doing its job. It is insulating the inside of the horse from the cold. So we touch the fur on the outside and we pat them, and it feels cold to us. And so we tend to think that the horse is cold. No, the horse's fur is doing its job, and it's cold on the outside and the horse is warm on the inside. So if the fur behaves in its normal way, it actually fluffs up, kind of like a down jacket or something made out of down that we're used to fluffing up to get the maximum amount of warmth out of it. So this becomes something we'll talk about with blanketing, because blanketing changes that natural fluffing. And horses can also exercise. If they're outside, these guys get cold. These are the horses that live here. They get cold, they go and run around the pasture for a couple minutes and warm up. Same thing for us. If we go and sweep the barn aisle, we get warm. So exercise and movement help keep things warm. Moisture. This is where cold, wet rain is more of a problem for horses staying warm. That 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or centigrade people, I didn't put that up there, but basically right around freezing and 10 degrees above. So probably 0 to 10 degrees centigrade. So when it's raining in that temperature, the horses can get cold. If there's enough rain that they get wet to the skin, that's when they get cold. Horses will naturally seek out a shelter, seek out a shed, seek out trees, seek out some place to be out of the driving rain in order to stay warmer. They will also shiver. Guess what? Shivering is actually a good thing. Shivering, what happens when you go outside and it's cold? You shiver, and the next thing you know, you forgot about it because you're warm. Shivering is a way of generating heat, just like exercising. So just because you see your horse shivering does not mean all bad. If he's has to stand out there and shiver all day long, then that can be much more of an issue. They're going to be burning calories and they're not happy. In nature, they would be looking for the shelters and the sheds and the trees to try and get out of that temperature. But when it's well below freezing, 20 degrees, 15, minus 10 degrees, really cold, you'll see them out in the middle of the pasture eating hay. They're totally unfazed by that because their fur is doing its job. It's the sweat that creates a problem because their skin gets wet. We have windy conditions. Horses will naturally seek shelter from the wind. You may have put a shed where you thought it was nice, and maybe where you could see your horses, and maybe you took time to face it away from the prevailing wind. And on a really cold, windy day, where are your horses? Not in the shed. They're standing in some corner of the pasture that they have figured out is sheltered from the wind. And depending on whether it's a southerly wind or a northerly wind or east or west, they may stand in different places in the pasture. They find the spot that they need to be in. So if you don't have any natural shelter, it is nice to provide a shed. And a shed or some kind of roof is a really nice way to keep horses outside, especially when you have a paddock that doesn't have a lot of natural trees or natural topography that will allow them to select their own place. And this is where if you're in a windy climate and it's really cold, this is where you might want to use or need to use a blanket. It is healthiest for horses to live outside most of the time. 8 to 12 hours a day minimum, more is better. If they're out for a good bit of the day, most of the entire day, they actually adapt to the cold, just as we do. A cold day, 40 degrees, like today, feels really cold because the last 2 weeks have been 60 and 70 degrees, which has been very comfortable. Suddenly today it feels cold. In the middle of winter, a 40-degree day will actually feel balmy and warm, even to us. So the horses are the same. So they adapt. They use their fur. And you can see some icicles hanging off of this horse's coat. The icicles are all on the outside. They're not bothering the horse at all. They're just bothering the humans.
And Joyce, I have 4 different horses. They're out practically 24/7. They do have sheds. How do I choose who to blanket, which blanket to use?
That's a great question because there isn't a perfect answer, unfortunately. So just as any other animal, horses, dogs, cats, and humans, and any other mammal, truthfully, some are cold-natured and really need their blankets, and some are hot-natured and really hate their blankets. So if you start to pay attention to your horse and you notice, does this horse always hang out in the sun? Well, that horse is probably cold-natured because they're always seeking sun, they're seeking warmth. Another horse might find every time you see them, they're in the shed or they're under the trees, they go out in the sun in the morning and evening. Those horses are probably running hotter. And so you have to get to know your individual horse and look at what their normal behaviors are, and then how warm or cool they get underneath a blanket. Our really old horses don't generate heat really well, just as our old humans do. You find that you're wearing extra sweaters once you get really into the 80s and 90s. So that one of the easiest ways to figure it out is to stick your hand inside the blanket when it's on the horse, if you have a blanket on. If you feel it really warm and either a little bit moist or a lot moist, you have too many blankets for that individual horse. If it's warm inside, totally dry, you're probably just about right. If you put your hand inside and it feels cold in there, you might actually need more in the way of blankets, partly because you've compressed the hair and the hair is not as fluffy as it is in nature without a blanket. So this is sort of, in a way, not answering your question directly, but this is really the only way we can do it. I believe that Shires has tried to come out with a blanket that will you the temperature inside and probably send it to your smartphone, but I haven't seen anybody adopt those yet. You're probably better off to use the old-fashioned hand inside the blanket method.
Pretty cool. What if I'm going to ride this winter? Should I clip or not?
Well, we have to look at sweat when we start to talk about clipping, not clipping, and how to manage these horses. So as the horses work, they produce sweat. Here, the skin becomes wet from the inside out. So the skin now is wet and the fur can't do its job. It's very different from the rain. You may see the outside of your horse looking wet, but if you just go and part the hairs, many times you will see that the skin is actually dry. When they sweat, the skin will be wet. And you know yourself, if you go outside and you've been sweating, you chill down very rapidly. So you can use hair dryers, heat lamps, coolers to try and dry your horse off if you have an extra 2 hours a day. Most of us don't have that luxury. And so if you're only going to ride once a month or maybe even once a week on the weekend when you have some time, that's probably fine and it will allow you to avoid clipping. But if you're going to ride regularly, then and get your horse sweating and you don't want to spend 2 hours trying to dry them off, then you're going to need to clip. And that is just a fact of life. Yes, it would be great to never clip, but it won't work if you're going to ride regularly. And especially if you're riding regularly on a horse that runs hot anyway. They can, on a 40-degree day, they can start to really sweat. So you need to clip, but consider clipping only part of the horse. Instead of shaving the whole thing, look at where your horse is sweating. If you are fox hunting, racing, eventing, really working hard, or you're showing and the sport that you're showing in really requires clipping, then you have to go ahead and clip. If you're going to do really long trail rides, you're going to need to clip. But think about it, because you can also just clip the areas that sweat. And about the only sport that adopts this regularly is the endurance people, because they like to keep their horses out and they like to minimally blanket. And they really don't care if there is a patch clipped out on the shoulder and a patch clipped out on the flank and maybe a little bit on the belly and on the chest. They don't mind that. And that way they need very little blanketing because there's very little skin actually exposed. They'll just need to blanket on a really windy day, a really rainy day. But a lot of the rest of the time, the horses will be fine. So it's perfectly okay not to have the perfect measured clip from one side to the other. Just do something effective, because once you've clipped, you're stuck with blanketing unless you just have these little spot clips. And if we're going to look at blanketing, we have to really look at fitting the blankets properly. Do you really want to wear your heavy winter coat, not your light puffy down jacket, but a heavy duty winter coat that doesn't fit all day long? No. So we're going to run through some slides on blanket fitting, and we've got some pictures. And if you're struggling with your own blanket, then really spend some time studying these and looking at what is happening with your blankets. So one of the best ways to tell that your blanket is fitting is that when you come in the morning, after the horse has worn it all night or all day, the front buckles should still be loose enough that I can put my hands underneath them. And the shoulders themselves should not have a lot of pressure. And a well-fitting blanket will be that way. If you come in the morning and your poor horse is strangled and the shoulders are all stretched and tight, that means your horse has been fighting against that all night long. And you're going to see stiff shoulders, you're going to see tight withers, you're going to see horses that are not moving freely. And so if your horse is a little bit older, arthritic, what you're going to see is that they get stiffer and stiffer during the winter. So the most common issue is that the blankets are too large around the opening for the neck. So see how low this blanket comes on the horse's shoulder itself. What we really want is the neck part of our blanket to be on this narrow part of the neck before the shoulders. What will happen here is not only will there be pressure on the shoulders, but as the top across the withers drifts back, you will get a tremendous amount of pressure across the withers. And it's extremely uncomfortable for the horses, not to mention that it really contributes to stiffness and pain. So when blankets are too big, they're not cheap items, and many times there's no need to go out and replace them. If the blanket is too big around the neck, all you have to do is sew a big dart in the neck to make it small enough to fit up into this area. So I'm going to take a nice big dart out of the side and sew that together. And you may be able to sew it by hand. You may be able to find somebody who repairs blankets or who just has a heavy duty sewing machine that can put this dart in. What will happen as you make this dart is that, see the nice little bulge now that we have over the shoulder, the front of the shoulder. Putting this dart in actually helps relieve pressure on the shoulder directly, just because it changes the way the blanket hangs. And it is a virtually free fix for a blanket that is really a problem. We have lots of blankets out now that are having gussets put in them. And this looks like a great idea, right? Because the horse can actually move his legs and have some extra room. But where is all that extra room? It's mostly down here. So what we need is a gusset that is higher up on the horse's leg, like this one, so that the shoulder pressure has some relief and has some extra material, so it has some movement. When the gusset is attached a little bit lower, closer, and some of them are even lower than this picture, every time the horse moves, you're still at the highest pressure. I guess I bumped that. You're still at the point of highest pressure. The horse has room to move his legs, but he doesn't have room to actually move his shoulders. So look at where the gusset is when you're buying a blanket with a gusset. There are blankets out there with adjustable necks. If you use that, make good use of it. If it's too loose, you'll have exactly the same problem with all the tension over the point of the shoulder and the neck being too big. Go ahead and nudge up, pull it forward, and then this gusset will work very well. There'll be lots of freedom over the point of the shoulder. The interesting thing is, and any blanket brands that appear in these pictures are irrelevant. all blankets can fit and all blankets cannot fit, just depending on the horse and the shape of the horse. So a lot of blanket companies seem to make their sheets the same size as their blankets, but without the stuffing. And so they fit too big. So you go to buy a 72 or an 84-inch blanket and it fits beautifully. So you then go and buy an 84-inch sheet and it's too big. And so you have to make sure that all your layers, if you're going to layer, all the layers have to fit. You can't cheat or have a bad fitting one layer, because that one layer will cause the whole mess to not fit. Occasionally, when you put the dart in, if the blanket is on the borderline of being the right size, you'll find that it will pull the back of the blanket forward because we're pulling it up on the neck, and the horse's rear will be exposed, which if they've got a good bushy tail and they've got big fur, you're fine if you haven't clipped that part. But if you're in a really windy country, you might find that that's a little uncomfortable for the horses.
And Joyce, I've got an older guy that I do blanket, and he's out in the field, really quiet guy. So sometimes I'll just take the blanket out there and throw it on him. Should I hook the belly straps first or the front first in case he was to start walking?
That's a really good question, because depending on how nice and lovely and sweet he is, you definitely want to be careful with some horses putting blankets on and off. The old guys that have been blanketed all their lives, they're fine to go out in the field and do it. But there are actually many injuries caused by blanketing horses that are unattached, or blanketing and buckling things in the wrong order, and then bad things happen in the barn and the horse is running around with a blanket that's half on and half off. Turns into a whole panic situation, and the horse ends up either hurting somebody or hurting themselves. So it's something that you definitely want to pay attention to. So the first thing to do is to put the blanket on and close your front buckles, because if the horse at that point were to take off, the blanket is not going to fall off his rear end and spook him. And you're going to be much, much safer. Yes, it could turn and he could step on it, but it's not likely to turn into a bucking strap, which if you've done the middle buckles first and the blanket happens to slide back right into the groin, that resembles a bucking strap. And that is what your horse may end up doing, which is not very much fun. So put on the front buckles first, and then pull it gently back into position. You don't have to pull it hard, just pull it back into about what would be its natural position, and do up your belly buckles. Taking it off, you want to reverse that for the same reason. You want to keep that front buckled till the last, so that when you take the front buckles off, you're removing the blanket. And that will avoid that unpleasant situation. And then you can get away with doing it out in the field.
Great.
So to sum up the whole blanket idea, blanket only if it's really needed. Fit your blankets well and adapt to each individual horse's needs and the temperature. And just be aware, just because it's January and you're in Canada does not mean that it's minus 40 degrees. It could be January in Canada and it could be 40 plus degrees or 50 or 60 degrees for a couple of days. And so that heavy blanket that you needed 3 days ago when you're in Colorado and the wind was 40 miles an hour, you don't need on those warm days. The hardest thing is when you leave for work at 5 a.m. and you know it's going to be warm in the middle of the day, but you're leaving for work and it's 15 degrees out. There is no perfect answer for that situation. If your horse runs warm, you may be able to just go ahead and take the blanket off. If your horse tends to run cold, then you might just leave the blanket on, and you'll have to deal with the fact that they may sweat underneath it. So when you come home, you're going to have to dry them off. And it's there, or you have a friend that you buy them a wine for Christmas or something and have them come over at lunchtime and take the blanket off. That's a really, really hard situation because there isn't a perfect answer. But we want to let the horses be horses as much as possible.
Yeah. And blanketing isn't the only way we can keep them warm. How else can we help them out?
Actually, we can do a lot with food. And interestingly enough, it's not about feeding more grain. It's going to be forage. So horses run on forage. The concentrates grains are only needed by horses that need more calories than they can take in with their forage. That can be, they might have a higher metabolic rate. Think about thoroughbreds. Maybe we're working really hard, doing a lot of training rides, high performance, long riding. And cold weather itself burns more calories. So you might, for some individuals, need to feed some more grain. But hay equals warmth. So as the horse in his cecum, which we don't have, so we can't eat hay to keep warm. In the cecum, the long stem fiber is broken down into nutritional components. That breaking down process generates heat as a byproduct. But that byproduct is really important in cold weather. So you will actually see, if you're really watching what your horses take in, is in really cold weather, below freezing for sure, the horses will actually eat more hay. They will consume more, but they're not going to be putting on weight. They are burning that fuel as calories to keep warm. So allow them to have more hay if the weather's really cold, and you'll find that they will usually clean up way more than you can feed them in the warmer weather. If that's still not doing it, then you can add more concentrates, but always add more hay first. It's way more effective.
So what if my guys just want to sit there and eat hay all day and get fat?
Yeah, I have one out in the field. Actually, I have a couple. So if they don't have weight issues, it's easy. You can free feed your hay. The ones that have weight issues, yes, you can control their hay intake, but if it's going to be freezing, you have X amount of hay that you've been in the warmer weather, and know that tonight is going to go down to 20 degrees, give them an extra flake or two. They will eat it, they will burn those calories, and that will not be a problem. If you give them that much extra and it's a warm night, then that extra hay is just going to calories. The cool thing is that slow feeders have become all the rage, and there is a gazillion types of slow feeders to slow your horses down. You can get nets for individual flakes, you can get square bale nets, you can get round bale nets, you can make homemade slow feeders. There are tons of ideas from do-it-yourself to very expensive. The one that we started using last year has turned out to be amazing, is this bale barn. And the net is built into it. So you just flip the unit up, put your bale down, flip the unit back down, and the net is there. What makes it very interesting is if you look over at the picture where the the hay has been eaten down, what is happening is that as the net, because of the outer covering, as the hay goes down, the net layers on top of itself because the horses can't pull it apart. So when we had an open feeder, they just pulled the net apart and all they had was one layer of net. Now they have, by the time they get to the bottom, there's 5 layers of netting. It makes them really pissed off, but we get 3 to 4 to 5 days extra on a bale, and we're not having the weight issues because they eat for a while and then they go out and hang out, sleep in the sun, and come back and eat for a while. They're just not able to get the volume of hay that they can get with a regular hay net over an open feeder. So that's for people that feed round bales. That's been a really cool find, and it's 10 times easier than putting the round bale in a net and then putting a cover on top of it. So another way for hay management is to soak your hay. The research is a little bit not quite conclusive, but if you've got high sugar hay, soaking your hay and then rinsing it out does actually seem to be an option. And I think the reason that the research is a little variable on how much sugar you get out of it is because the hay structure itself, some hays have more fiber in them, some hays have less. Some grasses, it's going to be easier to get sugar out. Some grasses, it's going to be harder to get the sugar out, just depending on how it's been harvested. But that can make a big difference, because if you've just bought a barn full of hay and that's all you can get, and you've just found out that your horse is insulin resistant or is getting really fat on your really good hay, then this is a way to salvage your hay. However, soaking hay is a pain in the rear end and in a few other places. It freezes in the winter, it ferments in the summertime. My friend Wendy Murdoch is just about to bring to market this hay soaker. So that's a link in there for the hay soaker. And that thing is really cool. You put in 4 or 5 flakes of hay. You can put it on, it's on a timer. You can have it soak the hay for an hour before you get home, drain it, and then by the time you're ready to feed it, you're ready to go. We were soaking hay this summer because we had that issue, and I am not one that can tolerate the hassles of soaking hay. This was a breeze. It really, really is going to be a cool addition to our hay management issues. One thing you can also do with your horse is to see if your hay has too much sugar in it. If your horse has a tendency to be fat and has a tendency to get a crusty neck, that tells you that your hay has too much sugar in it and you need to do something. You can also measure their weight with a weight tape, and you can see if they're gaining or losing each time you get a new batch of hay in.
So talking about hay, but like I still have some green grass, even though we've had some really cold temperatures. Should I be concerned about the horses on the grass?
Yes, because you live in the mid-Atlantic area. So the fescue belt, fescue is a cool season grass that grows best in the spring and fall. And it's the kind of middle part of the country, the mid-Atlantic area, all the way into Iowa, Illinois, and those parts of the country in the center. You don't have it way down south, and you don't have it in the farther north areas. What they call stockpiled fescue is a way to avoid feeding hay in the winter. The problem is that in the summer, fescue's bitter. They don't bother to eat it unless there's nothing else to eat. But as soon as you've had a good killing frost, all your other grasses die back, and fescue becomes your spring grass, essentially. Some fescue can have fructan levels 30% higher after a frost, and it becomes sweet to the horses. So their grazing pattern will change, and they will go and eat that portion of the field that they've been avoiding. So anybody that has green grass out in their fields, it's still in the winter, and live in this middle section of the country, you can have the same laminitis problems in January that you can have in May. And it's just from the richness of the grass. The one good thing about it is it doesn't keep growing. So if you graze down your paddock, you will get rid of most of it. So that will allow you to graze some in the winter. But you can still have issues with the frost and the fescue. The fructans and the sugars in the grass are usually lowest in the middle of winter if you've got really cold weather. But a lot of times we don't have really cold weather the way we used to in many parts of the country. Or we have spells where it warms up for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And if you go out in the field in one of those little warm spells, you will see that there still are green bases to the stems of many types of grasses. Those, when they get frozen, can actually increase their sugar content. The other thing that can happen in the snow belt areas is that the layers of snow actually insulate the ground, and the ground is not as cold because the snow is white and it reflects the light off of it. So you can have a snow and then you can have sugar after that. So it can kind of make you a little bit crazy, but you really need to know about this because you can end up with a surprise laminitis or obese horse in the middle of winter. So why are the local tack shops selling muzzles? This is the Harmony muzzle that I made for my horse who absolutely hated me when I did the regular muzzle. So I invented this much more open, airy muzzle that they can wear. And the muzzles in the Virginia area right now are actually selling in the tack stores because we've had 2 or 3 weeks, I think almost, of fairly warm weather. And the fescue has actually been growing very well. And so we're having to muzzle horses that are still on pastures. You have to watch out because they cannot eat hay very easily with most of the muzzles on the market. With this muzzle, if you cut out, there's a bunch of cutouts in the bottom. You can actually cut out all of them and they will be able to eat hay, but not hay that's in a muzzle itself, not hay that's in a bag. They can eat some of the free hay. But muzzles can be good because they get out and they exercise and they get to stay with their friends.
And, I've talked about my older guy. Sometimes he doesn't need the muzzle. I need to add some calories. What should he eat?
So there are definitely, I would say we have 70% of the horses that have too much weight, and we probably have 10 or 20% that have significantly too little weight, and we probably only have about 10% that stay fine all the time. So horses that don't have weight problems, obviously this is where to take advantage of your fescue and let them do some grazing and maybe graze down the fescue to where that horses can then be allowed to go out. What you want to do with these guys is to try and feed as much hay as possible, if you can, before just pouring on the grain and the concentrate. And we'll talk about a couple of other ways to get fats and proteins into them that are safer than a bunch of carbohydrates, because feeding too much grain and high carbohydrate diets have a tendency to pass through the stomach quickly and end up in the hindgut, and we end up with a lot of ulcer issues. So these horses are really easy keepers is our horses that either don't have weight problems or are too thin. The old-fashioned term of easy keepers that we put onto our fat horses is a total misnomer. It's twice as much work to take care of a fat horse as it is a thin horse because of all the grazing issues and the slow feeders and everything else that you have to do. So other things that we can do to add calories, and this is particularly important with some of the old horses that really do need extra calories and may or may not have the best teeth in the world to eat all of the hay. Oils and fats are our best pure calories. Just go look on Google and see how many calories there are in a quarter cup of oil. It's pure calories. And those are safe calories. Those are safe calories for our insulin resistant, our PPID or Cushing's type of horses that we don't want to feed a bunch of carbohydrates to. Some of those are actually on the thin side, and we need to feed them, but we've got to feed them safe foods, not carbohydrates, because the carbohydrates will still trigger the issues. So our hemp seeds and hemp oil, which I have on harmonyequine.com. And if you get confused between hemp seeds and CBD, we have a whole webinar that talks about those and the differences. But this is nutritional oil like you can buy in the grocery store. So the hemp seeds and hemp oil, flax seeds, chia seeds are all sources of oils. Flax and chia seeds, you have to feed quite a bit to in order to get enough fat, but you can do that. Coconut oil can be an excellent way to add oil. It does freeze hard. And so if you're in freezing climate and you don't have it in a heated tack room or just keep it in your house or your car, you'll find that it's a little hard to get out of the container. But it works very well. Rice bran oil, camelina oil, any kind of hopefully more natural oil, cold pressed rather than Costco's commercial 5 gallons of soybean or corn oil, because those are the least healthy oils that we can feed. You can add up to a cup per day to a horse's diet without any problems, and you can add more if you need it. The way you know if you've added too much oil is you'll start to see oil covering the manure coming out the backside. So if you're seeing oil out the backside, you're either feeding too much or you might need to add some enzymes to your horse's food, especially some of the older ones. But oils are great. Some horses will not do oils, so you might be able, they just don't like the taste or the texture. So you might be able to do something like a rice bran pellet that is really high in fat, or some other pelleted type of fat supplement. The other thing that we sometimes need to add is more protein. And many of the horses that need more calories will also need some more protein, but some of them really don't. Sometimes the way to tell whether your horse needs more protein is to look at their overall muscling. If they're 30 years old, they are going to sag, and you're not going to build muscle by just adding protein, because they can't at that age. That's like an 80-some-odd-year-old person. They can go to the gym all day, but they're not going to add a lot of muscle. So if you add extra protein, what you see in most balancer pellets, most feeds, is you have soybean meal. And soybean is almost all genetically modified, most places around the world. And they've extracted the oil from it. And it's really high in omega-6 oils, which are more inflammatory than anti-inflammatory. And so they really are not a good choice for adding protein, but they are in 80-85% of the feeds. Organic horse feeds tend to use peas for protein, and those can be okay to add as protein. I find that actually the best protein, and we can now get it in this country because hemp growing has become legal. I find hemp protein is probably the best because you get the benefits of the omega-3 fatty acids that are left when they make the protein concentrate. So when they make hemp protein, they do extract the oil from it, but there is some of that omega-3 oil left behind on the hemp protein. And so you can feed a really healthy source of protein, and it's very concentrated. Most hemp protein powders are going to be 30, 35% protein, maybe even 40%. So you only need a small amount of it to add quite a bit of protein.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna go on to hydration because I do have a pony who's not a good drinker. How do I lead the horse to water and make her drink?
That's always a challenge. And actually, low-grade dehydration and the old adage of can lead a horse to water, but they won't drink really holds true. And they will drink when they want to drink. Low-grade dehydration is definitely a problem in the winter, and you're likely to see some dry manure. You can do a skin pinch test on the side of their neck, and in a well-hydrated horse, you pinch the skin and let it go, and it should immediately go back to flat skin. If it stays puckered up, you have dehydration going on. Some of the very old horses, their skin has lost some elasticity and the test is not as accurate. And you can have your veterinarian help you check. Some horses will drink more if the water is warmed. Not all horses prefer warmer water. And the problem with having warm water, unless you kind of live around the barn and hang around the barn and you can warm up your water regularly, as soon as that water cools off, the horses that like warm water, they're not going to drink the cold water. So you bring out the warm water, they drink a half a bucket. That might be all they're really going to drink until the next time you come out with a bucket of warm water. So it isn't necessarily the best thing to use warm water unless you are committed to supplying warm water on a regular basis. Or you're giving them a treat. It's perfectly fine to give them a little bit of a treat on a cold, windy, damp day. In general, unless you are at your barn all the time, and there are many people who live next to their barn or who work at home, and it's easy to make sure they have plenty of warm water. And if your horses drink it, that's great. You can add sometimes some salts and electrolytes to encourage drinking, but make sure that they are drinking, because if they have decided that they hate the warm water or the cold water that you're bringing them, and you keep adding electrolytes to them, you'll actually make the dehydration worse. So I would do things like a couple of teaspoons of salt and see if that doesn't trigger it rather than trying to load up. Soaking foods, you can add a lot of water by soaking your food and feeding a wet mash or a wet, you can add a couple of quarts to your food. And you can add flavorings to water, and that can be a very effective way of doing it. However, the horse will become dependent on the flavorings, just as they become dependent on the warmth. So if you're going to add flavorings, you have to commit to adding flavorings all the time. And that's fine. Just make sure you continue to add flavorings.
And you know, do I need to worry if my horse loses a little bit of weight?
Actually, no. Now, losing weight in the wintertime is sort of considered a really bad, you're a bad mom, you're a bad dad, you're a bad horse caretaker if your horse is losing weight in the winter. But what happens in nature? In the winter, remember, horses like cold weather. Think about all the places in the world where horses live wild. Most of them have cold weather, except for a few. Most of them don't have a lot to eat in the winter. So horses naturally lose weight, as do most animals. They naturally lose weight, and sometimes they lose a lot of weight in the winter. Guess what? Spring comes, spring grass. Those horses that lost weight actually can now eat the spring grass. What happens with our horses that have not lost a pound all winter? Spring grass comes along and we're in the muzzle, we're putting them in the stall, we're doing everything we can to keep them off the spring grass because they can't afford to get any fatter. So I'm probably not going to be really popular for suggesting this, but I think that it probably is a good thing for our horses, certainly to lose 25 or 50 pounds throughout the winter. And then you are ready for some spring grass with a much safer metabolism and a much more natural metabolism. You don't want to have too much weight loss, and you have to watch your older guys that may not be absorbing their food as well. So this is where the weight tape is your friend. You need a weight tape. And you can check every couple of weeks. If you have blankets on, you're not looking at your horses necessarily every day. If you are seeing your horses every day and they don't have a blanket on, our eyes adjust and we get to thinking we know what our horse's weight is. And until they've lost or gained 25 to 50 pounds, our eyes don't see it. So the weight tape can tell you when you've lost 10, 20, 30 pounds and you go, okay, this is February and I've got 2 more months of winter and I'm 30 pounds down. I really need to be increasing my food intake so that I can slow that weight loss because spring's going to come and I'm going to be too thin. Many horses lose a lot of weight the first 2 or 3 weeks of spring grass because they're out busy eating grass and the grass is 3 millimeters tall. And they don't want their hay anymore because that spring grass is out there and they'll drop. In my neck of the woods, the end of April, all horses look terrible. And that's fine. That won't hurt them a bit. But you can add those extra calories if you need to.
Cool.
So the winter happens to be my season. I love the winter. The horses love winter generally. They have lots of extra energy, sometimes too much extra energy. The air is crisp and clear, and it's a great time to get out and really enjoy your horses. So hopefully this has helped you a bit.
Yeah, and we actually have a couple of really good questions. We may go just a scooch over our time. Regina said, I took a blanket off a horse one time that had static electricity and the horse went crazy and tore the blanket to pieces and took off bucking. How do you control static electricity?
That's a tough one. It's a great question. And it's a really tough question because the materials that are light and easy to use and easy to keep clean also produce quite a bit of static electricity. And some horses and people produce more static electricity than others. So one thing you can actually do is make sure you're getting those omega-3 and 6 omega-3 fatty acids, like in hemp oil, soil, or chia seeds, because the more oily the hair is, which is healthier, the less static electricity that you'll have. So that's one thing you can do. It doesn't solve the immediate problem. The other thing is trying to use, and I kind of don't like these because they're chemical, but the dryer sheets do decrease static electricity. And you want to try and find an unscented dryer sheet, and you can rub that on the inside of your blanket if you have one of these staticky horses. And the static producing horses seem to be way more sensitive than other horses. So it's a double-edged sword. You can try moistening things. I have horses that especially if I happen to wear a fleece jacket, that I have to moisten my hands to work on them, or even sometimes moisten my jacket to work on them, because they produce a lot of static electricity and they hate it. And the fleece, don't put anything fleecy on a horse that produces static electricity. That's a big no-no.
Excellent. Bevo, and I hope I pronounced your name right. What about an older horse who lives on hay cubes because he can't handle hay anymore?
That's a great question. And we actually did a bit of a nutritional webinar on the old horse, I think, somewhere on the YouTube channel. But it's perfectly fine for the older guys to eat hay cubes or hay pellets, even, as they really lose their teeth. You're already paying more attention to the idea of blanketing the older horses. So their digestive processes are not as good. Their ability to generate internal heat is not as good, and you can't feed them the fiber. So you can feed them extra if they want extra hay pellets. You can feed them extra hay pellets. But for those guys, your warmth is really going to come from your blanket. And you may have to layer them up in the really cold weather. And that's okay, because these old guys, they wouldn't be here if we weren't taking care of them.
And someone, let's see, Candace, no, someone offered Demetria, there are natural chemical-free dryer sheets for the previous question, as far as rubbing those on the blankets. Yeah.
Excellent. That's what I would get for sure. If
Yeah.
those exist, then use those.
And we'll do one
Thank
last, one last question from Stephanie. How do you treat blanket rubs on the withers?
Blanket rubs on the withers can be really frustrating. The first thing is to make sure your blanket is fitting correctly. But once you have that sore, even with a well-fitting blanket, replacing it can be a little difficult. I do have a horse that we've worked with for years, and the ultimate solution turned out to be one of the super slippery undershirts that you put on, and it allows the blanket to slide over and not catch the hair. You can attempt to do things like put some sheepskin, real sheepskin, not the fake stuff, over the area. But sometimes all you're really doing is increasing the pressure on the area. So the first thing I would try is really slippery, sort of a slinky type of under blanket, and let that blanket just slide over the top.
Great. Well, thank you, Joyce, for your expertise. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a big time thank you also to Docs Hemp for sponsoring us. Feel free to check out docshemp.com. They're having a Cyber Week special of 20% off all their signature products. And in the meantime, best wishes, everyone, for happy holiday season, and we will see you in 2021.
Great. Thanks, Steph. And thank you all for attending, and get out and enjoy that winter weather. And we'll keep this webinar series going.
Woo-hoo.
Take care, everyone.